Wanted to give you guys my setup information and some tips on this Eachine / Volantex P51D 500mm 4-channel brushless warbird. If you watch my my first look video on this plane, I talked about a safety feature that they built into the transmitter and the plane. That safety feature is that if it doesn't detect any input on the transmitter in 30 seconds, it locks the servos. And I discovered, quite by accident, that the throttle stick does not unlock those servos. You've got to actually provide some input on the servos themselves in order to unlock the servos. So I was out flying it, and I was doing something at the table, and it took me longer than 30 seconds before I launched it. You know, I was walking to the end of the lane, I throttled it up, I launched it into the air with a pretty good chuck, and it rolled over and nosed into the ground and broke one of the blades off of the prop. Luckily, I had my spare prop with me. But I didn't understand what was going on when that first happened. I picked it up and I checked it, and one of the servos wasn't moving when I picked it up, and I moved the stick back and forth, and then all of a sudden it was working. And so don't forget, before you launch it, if you hand launch it like I do, don't forget before you launch it, move your aileron stick back and forth. Make sure that the servos are actuating before you throttle it up and launch it, because if it happens to be longer than 30 seconds when you launch it, the servos are not going to be unlocked and it's going to crash. Okay, so that safety feature cost me a prop. But anyway, so I'm down to my last prop now on this plane. So there's the first tip for you. Don't make the mistake that I made. All right, so my plane came with 2 of the stock LiPos, and the stock LiPos are, you know, they're pretty short. They go in vertically. And I only have 2 of them, and you're going to want to fly it a lot more than twice, right? So I have these GNB2S 350 milliamp hour LiPos. They're 60C. I've used them for a couple of other planes, and I've got 4 of them. I bought a 4-pack of them, and I will have links to these in the show notes, along with the JST to XT30 to JST adapter, because these do have XT30 connectors on them. But I wanted to be able to use these, but they're too tall to fit to load in there vertically and be able to close the battery hatch on it. Okay, they're taller than the stock LiPos. So what I did was I cut out this section of foam here that's right on top of where the power cable comes out. You know, right there where the end of the battery housing is, where the battery hatch, you know, snaps into it. It has a pretty good section of foam covering that area, so I cut that out. I thought, well, cutting that piece of foam out is not going to, you know, lessen the strength of that area, because it's the plastic housing here that's really providing the strength. Okay, so I needed to do that to widen it, because these batteries have got to fit in horizontally, not vertically. Okay, so I took care of that part of it. And then there's 2 little raised sections. You know, it's kind of raised from the rest of the side of the battery bay, and it's on both sides. Now you got to be really careful, because if you could see right here, you've got your motor, your ESC wires that are coming underneath that foam ridge at the very bottom of it. So I took off about 80% of the height of those ridges, so that I could slide the battery in underneath that battery cover, because with the ridges it made it just too narrow to get the battery underneath it. So shaving those 2 raised ridges down by about 80% on the height of them allowed me to slide the end of that battery underneath the battery bay. Now if you do any of this, you know, because I used a utility blade to cut this foam out, if you do any of this, be very careful that you don't nick any of the wires. You've got your power cable coming underneath that first piece of foam that I cut out. You've got your motor wires coming underneath the second section of foam that I was carving out. So you got to be careful not to nick any of those. After doing that, I was able to take that 350 milliamp hour 2S LiPo and slide it right in there underneath the front of the battery bay and push it down inside the battery bay, and it's nice and snug fit inside there. It is not gonna move around on me. So that enabled me to use those other 4 batteries, and I've been flying with those 4 batteries now for 2 flight sessions. The stock LiPos are 22 grams each. This LiPo is 20 grams, but with the XT30 to JST connector, it puts it right at about 22 grams. So the balance is the same with this battery loaded in it as it is with the stock LiPos, and I've got my CG set. So whether I have the stock LiPo loaded in it or I have one of these loaded in it, I get a neutral balance right at my CG. So they work perfectly for that. All right, so I also found that the plane was just slightly tail heavy, just a little bit, not a whole lot. So what I did was, in this little foam panel here that you can pull out that gives you access to the motor mount if you ever need to pull the motor out. So I just put some Velcro on top of that. It's right in front of where the end of the battery bay is. And then I attached some Velcro to a US penny, and a US penny weighs 2.5 grams. So I found that putting that Velcro on there at that location and then Velcroing a penny to that, and the reason that I didn't glue it on there, I'm using Velcros, because if I decide to use a lighter weight battery but I need a little more nose weight to get the CG, or if I use a little heavier battery and I don't need that nose weight on there, it enables me to either remove or change the amount of nose ballast weight I've got on it. So that worked out really well. All right, and you can see it here. Here I've got the battery loaded, the bay is closed. You can see where I've got the Velcro located. So the weight of the US penny, as I said, was 2.5 grams, and the weight of the Velcro probably puts it about 2.6 to 2.7 grams of nose ballast weight. And with that nose ballast weight, it flies nice and level, and it handles really, really well. So that's what I had to do with that. Also, I don't know if I discussed this in the first look video, but I did take a look at the board, and it does have 2 external ports on it, a DSM and an S-Bus PPM port for an external receiver. So even if you don't have a multi-protocol transmitter that can support the V761 protocol, which is what that board uses, you can add an external DSM or S-Bus PPM receiver to that board and use whatever hobby grade transmitter you happen to have. So I love the fact that more and more manufacturers are putting these receiver ports on these boards so that you can fly them with a hobby grade transmitter. At least some of these companies are realizing now that being able to fly these planes with a hobby grade transmitter is going to sell more units. Okay, so we're back to the beginning here. So now let me bring up my setup file, and I've got a link to the setup file in the show notes if you guys want to download this. It's a PDF file that you can keep for your reference, okay? I don't know if the Eachine branded and the Volantex branded versions of these planes are exactly the same, but I would assume that they probably are. I like the fact that it comes in a ready to fly and a bind and fly. So if you have a hobby grade transmitter, it's not one more, toy grade transmitter that you're going to have to throw away. So that's great. Okay, I haven't had to change anything on the default linkage on mine, but the Volantex linkage might be set up a little bit differently. The fact that the linkage, the way mine had the linkage set up, worked out great for me doesn't mean it'll work great for you. It doesn't mean that the plane that you receive is going to have the same linkage set up that mine has. You got to remember, the people who are assembling these planes don't know anything about that stuff. And so when you receive yours, it may be set up differently. But this works really well for me with my hobby grade TX, with the amount of dual rate and expo I have in, with the linkage set up this way. It flies extremely well. It gives me plenty of control authority while being smooth. The controls are very smooth. So on the aileron control horn, it's a three-hole control horn. It's in the center hole. On the aileron servo arms, those aren't adjustable. You've just got a single control horn on each side with one hole. So that's not adjustable. The elevator control horn, again, is in the center hole, three-hole control horn. The elevator servo arm is in the innermost hole, two-hole control arm. The rudder control horn, that's in the center hole. It's a three-hole control horn on the rudder, and that gives it a ton of rudder authority. I don't think anybody's going to have to change that. The rudder servo arm is in the outermost hole. It's a two-hole control arm. It has two control linkages in there, so both those holes are already occupied. The outermost hole is used for the rudder control surface, and the innermost hole is used for the steerable tail wheel. It has a steerable tail wheel. Okay, so here's the recommended radio setup. This is what I'm using. The deflection of the control surfaces is measured opposite where the control horn is located, and it's also measured in manual mode. So make sure that when you bind up to it, you don't activate the gyro. You've got your switch selector in expert mode or manual mode. I've got 100% dual rates on all three control surfaces: aileron, elevator, rudder. I have very little expo in this, and it's very smooth. Just 20% expo on the aileron, 10 on the elevator, and 10 on the rudder. And my deflection is 7 millimeters on the elevator. Doesn't take much. 7 millimeters up, 7 millimeters down. For the aileron, for the elevator, even less. 4 millimeters up, 4 millimeters down. That gives me plenty of control authority with the elevator. And the rudder is 10 millimeters left and 10 millimeters right. There was no specified CG, but once I got it all lined out, got it balanced the way I like, the way it flies, I have it 24 millimeters from the lean edge of the wing, just outside of the outer gun turrets. So there's 3 gun turrets, little foam gun turrets on each wing. And if you measure back just from the outside of the outer gun turret, 24 millimeters, that's where I have mine balanced neutral, to where it's completely level. When I balance it at that point, it doesn't nose down, it doesn't nose up. That's how I like mine balanced. I launch it at 75% throttle with a pretty forceful chuck with a slightly upward angle. It takes right off, no problem. Alright, that gives you my complete setup for this plane and the tips. Don't forget about that 30-second lock on the servos. If the servos haven't been actuated within 30 seconds, make sure you do that before you launch it. Alright? You don't want to end up breaking a prop like I did. Alright, that's a wrap on this episode. Stay tuned, and I'll see you next time in the Tinkerz Lab.